The small town of Maplewood hadn't seen a new face in months, so when Isabella Bennett stepped off the bus that Tuesday morning, a few curious glances followed her across the town square. She carried just one suitcase and wore a simple blue dress, with comfortable walking shoes, nothing that would make anyone look twice. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and large sunglasses hid much of her face despite the cloudy spring day. Isabella had rented a modest cottage on the edge of town, sight unseen. As the taxi dropped her off, she stood for a moment, looking at the yellow clapboard house with its small garden and white picket fence. It was about as far from the grand apartments and luxury hotel suites she'd known as one could get. And that was exactly the point. "This will do nicely," she whispered to herself, a hint of a smile crossing her face. For the first time in years, no one was watching her, waiting for her, expecting anything from her. The weight of fame had finally been set down, at least for now. 3 years earlier, Isabella had been known to the world as Elena Vassallo, one of the most celebrated opera sopranos in modern history. Her performances at La Scala in Milan, the Metropolitan Opera in New York, and the Royal Opera House in London had earned her standing ovations that sometimes lasted 15 minutes. Critics called her voice a gift from heaven itself and the voice of a generation. Her face had graced magazine covers, and her recordings sold millions. Then, at the height of her fame, she disappeared from public view. The official story was exhaustion and vocal strain. The truth was more complicated. The cottage was furnished simply but comfortably. Isabella unpacked her few belongings, careful with one particular case that contained treasured sheet music and a few cherished photographs from her former life. She placed these in the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser, buried under sweaters. Her new life wouldn't involve looking back. By her second day in Maplewood, Isabella had located the grocery store, the library, and the small cafe where locals gathered for morning coffee. She kept her interactions brief and friendly, introducing herself only as Isabella Bennett, recently widowed and looking for a quiet place to start over. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had married Thomas Bennett 6 years ago, and though they'd divorced just before her disappearance from public life, she'd kept his name for the anonymity it offered. What Isabella needed most was something to fill her days, something that would allow her to be near music without the crushing pressure of performance. The flyer on the community bulletin board seemed like fate. Maplewood Community Choir, all welcome, no auditions required. The following evening, Isabella slipped into the back row of the community center's main room. About 25 people, of various ages, were already seated in a semicircle, chatting comfortably with each other. At the front, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses sorted through sheet music at a small piano. "Good evening, everyone," he called out as the clock struck 7. "I see we have a new face joining us tonight." He smiled warmly in Isabella's direction. "I'm Richard Thompson, but everyone calls me Rich. I teach music at the high school and somehow got roped into conducting this rowdy bunch 5 years ago." A friendly chuckle rippled through the group. Isabella felt herself relaxing slightly. "Would you mind introducing yourself?" Rich asked gently. Isabella stood, her hands clasped tightly together, an old habit from her conservatory days. "Hello, I'm Isabella Bennett. I just moved to town and saw your flyer. I've always enjoyed singing, though it's been some time since I've done it properly." The careful understatement made her smile inwardly. "Well, you're very welcome here, Isabella. Can you tell us what part you typically sing?" "Soprano," she answered simply, though in her mind she heard the more precise description. "Dramatic coloratura soprano with an exceptional 3-octave range. Wonderful. We can always use more sopranos. Why don't you sit with Judy and Helen there? In the second row? They'll help you follow along tonight." The two women waved her over, and Isabella found herself sandwiched between a retired schoolteacher and a local bakery owner, both of whom whispered helpful comments as Rich began the warm-up exercises. "Just follow along as best you can for tonight," he called out. "We're preparing for our spring concert, so we're midway through most of the pieces." As they began simple scales, Isabella carefully modulated her voice, keeping it pleasant but unremarkable. When she was younger, her vocal coach had taught her how to sing small for practice, using just a fraction of her real power and technique. It had been years since she'd needed that skill, but it came back naturally. Despite her efforts to blend in during a particularly tricky run, Isabella forgot herself for just a moment. Her voice carried the notes with perfect pitch and crystal clarity, rising above the group briefly before she caught herself and pulled back. Rich's head snapped up from the piano, his fingers pausing momentarily as his eyes sought the source of that perfect phrase. When his gaze landed on Isabella, she quickly looked down at her sheet music, pretending to be completely focused on following along. After rehearsal, as people gathered their belongings, Rich approached her. "You have a lovely voice, Isabella. Have you had training?" She nodded slightly. "Some when I was younger. Nothing serious." "Well, you have excellent pitch. That will be very helpful in our soprano section." He smiled, but there was curiosity in his eyes. "What brings you to Maplewood, if you don't mind my asking?" Isabella had her story ready. "I needed a change of scenery after my husband passed. Somewhere quiet where I could find myself again." It wasn't entirely untrue. After the divorce, and her subsequent breakdown from exhaustion, she had indeed needed to rediscover who she was away from the spotlight. Rich nodded sympathetically. "Well, music can be healing. I hope you'll find some comfort here with us." "I already am," she replied, and meant it. In the weeks that followed, Isabella settled into a quiet routine. Mornings were spent tending to her small garden or walking along the town's peaceful streets. Afternoons often found her at the library, where she read everything from detective novels to poetry, luxuries she'd rarely had time for during her demanding career. And every Wednesday evening she joined the choir, carefully maintaining her disguise as just another amateur singer with a nice voice. She made a few casual friendships, particularly with Judy and Helen, who invited her to their weekly coffee gatherings. She declined more often than not, preferring her solitude, but occasionally joined them to maintain the appearance of normality. What no one in Maplewood knew was that in the privacy of her cottage, with curtains drawn and doors locked, Isabella still practiced. In the shower, her voice would soar through the most challenging areas in her repertoire. Sometimes, when she was certain no neighbors were nearby, she would stand in her small living room and let her full voice fill the space, singing the roles that had made her famous: Violetta, Queen of the Night, Lucia. These moments were bittersweet, reminders of what she had walked away from, but also of the freedom she now enjoyed. No directors scrutinizing her every note, no critics waiting to pounce on the slightest imperfection, no fans tracking her every move. Just music, pure and simple, for no one but herself. As spring progressed toward summer, the choir began more serious preparations for their annual concert. Rich announced they would be performing a variety of pieces from folk songs to Broadway classics, with a few more challenging classical selections. "And I've decided to include one opera piece," he told them one evening, distributing new sheet music. Just a simple chorus from Carmen, nothing too intimidating. Isabella accepted her copy with a slight smile. She had sung the role of Michaela in Carmen at the Vienna State Opera to rave reviews. The chorus part would be child's play. What she didn't know was that Rich had been watching her carefully during rehearsals, noticing how effortlessly she sight-read difficult passages, how perfect her breath control was, how she occasionally had to stop herself from correcting others' techniques. His suspicions were growing that there was much more to Isabella Bennet than met the eye, and he was right. Behind her carefully constructed facade of ordinariness, one of the greatest sopranos of her generation was hiding in plain sight, finding healing in anonymity, yet unconsciously preparing for a return to the thing she loved most in the world, sharing the transcendent power of her voice. 2 months had passed since Isabella joined the Maplewood Community Choir. Spring had fully blossomed into summer, and the sleepy town had come alive with weekend farmers markets and evening concerts in the park. Isabella had settled comfortably into her quiet life, her famous past safely tucked away in the bottom drawer with her old photographs. The choir rehearsals had become the highlight of her week. There was something wonderfully freeing about singing, without the weight of perfection, about blending her voice with others rather than carrying the spotlight alone. She'd become quite fond of the eclectic group, from teenagers fulfilling school arts requirements to retirees who'd been singing together for decades. Rich Thompson had proven to be a surprisingly capable director. He lacked the ruthless precision of the conductors Isabella had worked with in Milan and New York, but his genuine love for music and patient teaching style brought out the best in his amateur singers. "All right, everyone," Rich called out during a Wednesday rehearsal in late June. "Our concert is just 3 weeks away and we need to finalize our program." The group rustled with excitement. The annual summer concert was Maplewood's cultural highlight, drawing people from neighboring towns and even a few tourists passing through. "We've got our folk medley in good shape, and the Broadway selections are coming along nicely," Rich continued, shuffling through his notes. "Now, about our classical piece," where he paused, and Isabella noticed a flicker of concern cross his face. "Is everything okay, Rich?" asked Judy from beside Isabella. Rich sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "Well, I had planned for us to perform the habanera from Carmen, but I've just learned that Patricia Williams, the music professor from the community college who was going to join us for the solo, she's broken her ankle while hiking. She'll be in a cast for at least 6 weeks." A disappointed murmur rippled through the group. Patricia had performed with them last year, and her rich mezzo-soprano had elevated their humble choir to something truly special. "Can't we choose another piece?" someone suggested from the back row. "With only 3 weeks left?" Rich shook his head. "We'd never get it performance ready in time. I was thinking we might just have to drop the classical portion this year." Isabella felt a strange twisting in her stomach. Part of her, the part that had come to Maplewood seeking anonymity, knew she should keep quiet. Yet another part, the artist who had lived for the stage, couldn't bear the thought of abandoning such beautiful music. Before she could resolve this inner conflict, Helen spoke up beside her. "What about Isabella? She's got a lovely voice." All heads turned toward Isabella, who felt heat rising to her cheeks. She hadn't blushed before an audience in years. "Oh, I don't think," she began. "Actually," Rich interrupted, his eyes studying her with newfound intensity, "that's not a bad idea at all. Isabella, would you consider it? I've noticed your technique is, well, quite advanced for someone who claims to have had only some training." Isabella swallowed hard. She'd been careful during rehearsals, or so she thought, to hold back, to blend in. Had she slipped without realizing it? "The habanera is quite demanding," she said carefully. "I'm not sure I'd do it justice." Rich tilted his head slightly, a curious expression crossing his face. I was thinking we might try something even more ambitious now that I consider it. Not the habanera, but what about the aria, Sempre Libera from La Traviata?" Isabella nearly gasped aloud. Sempre Libera had been her signature piece, the aria that had made her famous, the one that had earned her a 20-minute standing ovation at La Scala. It was one of the most challenging pieces in the soprano repertoire, demanding perfect coloratura technique, breathtaking high notes, and profound emotional depth. She noticed Rich watching her reaction closely, almost as if he were testing her. Did he suspect something? Or was this simply an incredible coincidence? "That's an extremely difficult piece," she managed to say. "Too difficult?" he asked, and there was definitely a challenge in his voice now. The choir members glanced back and forth between them, sensing the strange tension that had suddenly filled the room. "I'd need to see the music," Isabella said at last, buying time to think. Rich smiled, walked to his bag, and pulled out a folder. "As it happens, I have the score right here." Of course he did, Isabella thought. This was no coincidence. As Rich handed her the sheet music, their eyes met briefly. In his, she saw not just curiosity, but something like recognition. Not that he knew who she really was, that seemed impossible, but that he recognized something in her that didn't belong in an amateur community choir. The rest of the rehearsal passed in a blur. They worked on the Broadway selections while Isabella sat quietly, the Verdi aria burning a hole in her lap. She knew every note by heart, could have sung it in her sleep. She'd performed it dozens of times on the world's greatest stages. And now she was being asked to sing it in a small-town community center. After rehearsal, as the others were gathering their things and chatting, Rich approached her. "I hope I didn't put you on the spot," he said, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what he'd done. "It's an unusual choice for a community choir," Isabella replied carefully. "True, but sometimes we need to challenge ourselves." He paused, studying her face. "You know, you remind me of someone." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. "Oh? I can't quite place it, but there's something familiar about you." He shrugged. "Anyway, think about the aria. I believe you could do it justice." As Isabella walked home through the quiet streets of Maplewood, her mind was in turmoil. Singing Sempre Libera would be like announcing to the world, "Here I am. Elena Vassallo is back." Was she ready for that? Had she come to this quiet town only to be discovered? Yet the thought of singing that magnificent aria again, of letting her true voice soar after months of restraint, was undeniably tempting. In Due Maimerdane, her cottage unable to sleep, Isabella pulled out the bottom drawer of her dresser and retrieved a small wooden box. Inside was a USB drive containing recordings of her greatest performances. She plugged it into her laptop and found the video, La Traviata at the Metropolitan Opera, 5 years ago. As she watched her former self on the screen, resplendent, in Violetta's gown, her arms outstretched to embrace both the music and the adoring crowd, tears slipped down her cheeks. That woman seemed like a stranger now, so confident, so brilliant, so alive in the music. When had performing begun to feel like a prison rather than a joy? The next morning, after a night of little sleep, Isabella made a decision. She would sing the aria, but she would hold something back. She would perform it well enough to satisfy the choir and impress the local audience, but not so brilliantly that anyone might connect Isabella Bennett with the great Elena Vassallo. At the next rehearsal, she told Rich she would do it. "Wonderful," he exclaimed, looking genuinely pleased. "Let's set aside some time for you to rehearse with just the piano." "I'd prefer to work on it at home first," Isabella said. "I'll need to refresh my memory of the piece." Rich nodded, but that curious look returned to his eyes. "Of course, take all the time you need." In the days that followed, Isabella began to prepare. At first, she practiced in whispers, humming the intricate runs and trills under her breath as she worked in her garden or washed dishes. Then, when she felt secure in her cottage with windows closed, she allowed herself to sing, softly at first, then with more confidence. It was like reuniting with an old friend. Her voice, her real voice, responded immediately to the familiar patterns, the muscle memory still intact despite the months of disuse. The coloratura passages that had once seemed so daunting now flowed effortlessly from her throat. The high notes rang clear as bells in her small living room, but each time she reached the climactic moments, she consciously held back, reminding herself, "You are Isabella Bennett now. Not Elena Vassallo, not anymore." A week later, she agreed to stay after rehearsal to practice with Rich at the piano. The rest of the choir had left, and the community center was quiet, except for the occasional sound of the janitor's cart rolling past the door. "Whenever you're ready," Rich said, his fingers poised above the keys. Isabella took a deep breath and nodded. As the familiar introduction began, she closed her eyes, transported back to stages in New York, Milan, London. Then she began to sing. She had intended to hold back, to give a performance that was good, but not extraordinary. But as the music filled the room, something unexpected happened. The joy of the aria, Violetta's passionate declaration of freedom, overtook her. Note by perfect note, her true voice emerged, soaring through the complex runs, building toward the triumphant high notes that had once brought audiences to their feet. When she finished the final phrase, the sudden silence in the room was deafening. Isabella opened her eyes to find Rich staring at her, his hands frozen above the piano keys, his mouth slightly open in astonishment. "My God," he whispered. "Who are you, really?" Isabella felt the carefully constructed walls of her new life beginning to crumble. In that moment, standing in the fluorescent-lit community center with just one stunned listener, she had revealed more of herself than she had intended. The question now was, how much more was she willing to reveal? Isabella stood frozen, heart pounding against her ribs as Rich's question hung in the air between them. The community center's harsh fluorescent lights suddenly felt like spotlights, exposing her in ways she hadn't planned. "I told you," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Isabella Bennett." Rich slowly closed the piano lid and stood up. "You have one of the most extraordinary voices I've ever heard. That wasn't just good technique, that was transcendent." He shook his head in disbelief. "No one sings Sempre Libera like that without years of professional training." Isabella looked away, busying herself with gathering her sheet music. "I studied voice in college. It was a long time ago." "Which college?" Rich asked, not unkindly but with obvious skepticism. "It doesn't matter," Isabella replied. "That was another life." A long silence stretched between them. Isabella could feel Rich studying her face, trying to place her, to solve the puzzle she represented. "All right," he said finally. "I won't pry. But whatever your story is, Isabella, or whoever you are, your secret is safe with me." He gestured toward the piano. "Would you like to continue?" Relief washed over her. He wasn't going to press. Further, at least not tonight. She nodded gratefully. "From the beginning?" she asked. "Actually," Rich said, reopening the piano, "let's work on the cadenza. Your interpretation was interesting." Isabella smiled despite herself. She knew exactly what he meant. She had deliberately simplified some of the more complex runs, something the real Elena Vassallo would never have done. "You mean I took some liberties with it?" she corrected him. Rich's eyes sparkled with amusement. "That's a diplomatic way of putting it." For the next hour, they worked together on the aria. Rich was a better pianist than Isabella had given him credit for, and he had a surprisingly nuanced understanding of the piece. She found herself genuinely enjoying the rehearsal, even as she continued to hold back, to dampen the full power and range of her voice. "You know," Rich remarked as they were finishing, "you could sing this piece any way you wanted on performance night, and this town would still give you a standing ovation. They've never heard anything like your voice before." "I'll keep that in mind," Isabella said, gathering her things. "Good night, Rich." Walking home under a sky full of stars, Isabella felt strangely lighter than she had in months. Someone had recognized her talent, not her fame or her name, but her gift, and it didn't feel threatening. It felt validating. The next rehearsal. With the full choir brought a new kind of tension. News had spread that Isabella would be performing the Verdi aria, and curious glances followed her everywhere. Judy and Helen bombarded her with questions. "Why didn't you tell us you could sing like that?" Helen asked during their warm-up exercises. Isabella shrugged. "It never came up." "Rich says you're phenomenal," Judy whispered. "He says we're in for a real treat." "He's being kind," Isabella deflected. "I'm just doing my best with a difficult piece." When the time came to rehearse the aria with the choir providing subtle backing vocals for certain sections, Isabella could feel everyone's attention focused intensely on her. She took a deep breath, nodded to Rich at the piano, and began to sing. She had planned to maintain her restraint, to give a good but not revelatory performance. But something happened as the familiar music filled the room. The act of singing, really singing in front of an audience again, awakened something in her that had been dormant for too long. Phrase by phrase, note by note, more of her true voice emerged. By the time she reached the triumphant conclusion, Isabella was no longer holding back. The final high note soared through the community center, pure and powerful and perfect. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence, before the choir erupted in spontaneous applause. "My goodness," Judy exclaimed, her eyes wide. I've never heard anything like that in person. You've been hiding a world-class talent from us, Helen added, shaking her head in amazement. Isabella blushed, unused to receiving such direct praise after months of anonymity. Thank you, she murmured, embarrassed by the attention. Rich was watching her with a barely contained smile. I think our classical section is going to be the highlight of the concert this year, he announced to the group. As they continued rehearsing the other pieces, Isabella could feel the dynamic had shifted. Choir members who had treated her as just another newcomer now regarded her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She heard whispers, caught sidelong glances, noticed how people seemed slightly hesitant to speak to her directly. It was the beginning of the very thing she had come to Maplewood to escape. After rehearsal, Rich approached her again. That was beautiful, he said, but different from how you sang it when we were alone. Isabella nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. I got caught up in the moment. It happens to the best of us, he replied with a knowing smile. Then, more seriously, the concert is in 2 weeks. Are you sure you're ready for this? Once people hear you sing like that? He didn't need to finish the thought. Isabella understood perfectly. Once people heard her, really heard her, questions would follow. Attention would follow. I'll be fine, she assured him, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. The following days brought a flurry of activity as final preparations for the concert got underway. Posters appeared around town announcing the Maplewood Community Choir's annual summer concert, with special mention of a soprano soloist performing Verdi. Isabella walked past one such poster on her way to the grocery store and felt a strange pang at seeing herself reduced to such anonymity after years of having her name emblazoned in huge letters on opera house marquees around the world. During what would be their final solo rehearsal before the concert, Rich stopped playing halfway. Through the aria, is something wrong? Isabella asked. No, he said thoughtfully. Just the opposite. I've been trying to place your voice and who you remind me of. It's been driving me crazy for days. Isabella felt her mouth go dry. And? There's something about your phrasing, especially in the coloratura sections. He shook his head. Never mind, it's probably just coincidence. What is? Isabella pressed, heart racing. Rich looked at her directly. You're going to think I'm crazy, but you remind me of Elena Vassallo. The name, her name, spoken aloud, in this context made Isabella's breath catch. She forced a laugh. The opera singer? That's quite a compliment. Have you heard of her? Rich asked, watching her face carefully. Of course, Isabella said, trying to keep her voice casual. Everyone in the classical music world knows Elena Vassallo. I saw her perform once, Rich said, his eyes growing distant with the memory. La Traviata at the Met, about 5 years. Ego. It was transcendent, the kind of performance you remember for the rest of your life. Isabella remembered it too. The emerald green gown she'd worn, the way the conductor had nearly missed a cue because he'd been so moved by her first aria, the thunderous applause that had seemed to go on forever. I've heard she was very good, Isabella said softly. The best, Rich corrected. Which makes it all the more tragic that she disappeared. No one knows what happened to her. There were rumors of vocal problems, exhaustion, even a nervous breakdown. She just vanished from the stage. Perhaps she needed a break, Isabella suggested, her voice barely steady. The pressure of that life. It must be overwhelming. Rich nodded thoughtfully. I suppose so. Still, what a loss for the world of music. He turned back to the piano. Anyway, shall we continue? They resumed the rehearsal, but Isabella felt shaken. Rich had come dangerously close to the truth. Was it only a matter of time before he or someone else made the connection? That night, unable to sleep, Isabella took out her laptop and, for the first time since arriving in Maplewood, searched for news about Elena Vassallo. The articles were much as she expected. Speculation about her disappearance continued even 3 years later. Some claimed she had lost her voice, others that she had suffered a mental breakdown. A few suggested she had simply grown tired of the relentless demands of her career. None had discovered her quiet life in Maplewood. One headline caught her attention. Vassallo's former manager. She will return when she's ready. Isabella clicked on the article, feeling a pang at the sight of Gabriella Moretti, her manager, of 12 years and perhaps the only person who had truly understood her decision to step away. Elena hasn't left music forever, Gabriella was quoted as saying. She needed time to rediscover why she fell in love with singing in the first place. When that happens, when music becomes joy rather than obligation again, she'll be back, and her voice will be even more extraordinary for the journey she's taken. Isabella closed the laptop, tears streaming down her face. Gabriella had understood what even Isabella herself had not fully grasped until this moment. She hadn't left music forever. She had simply needed to find her way back to its heart. The following Wednesday was their final full rehearsal before the concert. As Isabella walked into the community center, she noticed something different. The usual friendly chatter died down as she entered, and several unfamiliar faces turned toward her with obvious curiosity. Rich greeted her with an apologetic look. "I hope you don't mind, but word has spread about our amazing soprano soloist. A few people from the local paper and the community college music department asked if they could sit in on our final rehearsal." Isabella felt a flutter of panic. The very thing she had been avoiding, attention, scrutiny, was becoming unavoidable. But as she looked around at the expectant faces of her fellow choir members, at Rich's encouraging smile, she felt something else too. A strange readiness. "That's fine," she said, surprising herself with her calm. "I don't mind at all." As they began the rehearsal, working through the folk songs and Broadway tunes before the classical piece, Isabella found herself looking forward to her aria with an eagerness she hadn't felt in years. When Rich finally nodded to her to take her position for Sempre Libera, she stepped forward without hesitation. The introduction began. Those familiar notes that had once been as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. Isabella closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would change everything. Tonight, she would sing, not as Isabella Bennett pretending to be less than she was, not even as Elena Vassallo the opera star, but simply as herself, a woman who had been given an extraordinary gift and had, perhaps, finally found her way back to the joy of sharing it. The morning after the final rehearsal, Isabella woke to the sound of birds singing outside her cottage window. For a moment she lay still, savoring the simple pleasure of this quiet awakening, so different from the hotel alarms and urgent phone calls that had started her days in her previous life. Then she remembered how she had sung the previous night, without restraint, without hiding, and a mixture of exhilaration and anxiety swept through her. She had made a choice, perhaps without fully realizing it at the time. After months of hiding, of dampening her light, she had allowed her true voice to emerge. Now she would have to face the consequences. As she prepared her morning tea, a knock at the door startled her. Visitors were rare at her cottage. She tightened the belt of her robe and opened the door to find Rich standing on her porch, holding a newspaper and wearing an expression she couldn't quite read. "Good morning," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" "May I come in?" he asked, his voice unusually serious. Isabella hesitated, then stepped aside. Rich entered, glancing around at her simple living room with its bookshelves and comfortable furniture, the upright piano in the corner the only hint of her musical past. "I brought you this," he said, handing her the paper. It was the local weekly, the Maplewood Gazette. On the front page was a headline, "Mystery Soprano Stuns at Choir Rehearsal." Isabella skimmed the article with growing unease. Someone at the rehearsal, presumably one of the visitors from the community college, had written a glowing account of her performance, describing her as a voice that belongs on the world's great stages, and speculating about her background and training. "It's a small town," Rich said gently. "People talk, and after the way you sang last night, well, people are definitely talking." Isabella sank onto her sofa. "I see. There's more," Rich continued. He pulled his phone from his pocket and sat beside her. One of our guests last night was Arthur Peterson. Does that name mean anything to you? Isabella's stomach tightened. Should it? He used to be a music critic for the New York Times. Retired here about 5 years ago. Apparently, he's a big opera buff. Rich handed her the phone. On the screen was a social media post from Arthur Peterson. Heard the most extraordinary voice in Maplewood last night. Could it possibly be the vanished diva herself? Elena Vassallo lives. Isabella handed the phone back, her hand trembling slightly. I don't understand. Rich took a deep breath. Isabella, if that's really your name, I need to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. He looked her in the eyes. Are you Elena Vassallo? The question hung in the air between them. Isabella felt a strange sense of relief mixed with fear. The moment she had both dreaded and perhaps secretly longed for had arrived. Why would you think that? She asked quietly. Because I've heard Vassallo sing. I've watched recordings of her performances dozens of times. Because I recognize that voice, that technique, that particular quality that can't be imitated or taught. He leaned forward. And because Arthur Peterson was the chief music critic during Vassallo's rise to fame, he would certainly recognize her. Isabella stood and walked to the window, looking out at her small garden. The roses she had planted in spring were in full bloom now, their sweet scent drifting through the open window. What if I were? She asked finally. What would happen then? That depends on you, Rich replied. Arthur's post hasn't gotten much attention yet. Maplewood isn't exactly the center of the opera world. But if Elena Vassallo is really hiding in our little town, performing with our community choir, that would be news. Big news. Isabella turned to face him. I came here for peace, Rich. For a chance to just be a person, not a commodity. Rich's expression softened. So it is you. After a long moment, Isabella nodded. Yes. She watched Rich's face as the confirmation sank in. His eyes widened slightly and he let out a low whistle. I knew it, he murmured. I couldn't believe it, but I knew it. He shook his head in wonder. Elena Vassallo in my choir. It's like finding out. I've been giving batting tips to Babe Ruth. Despite herself, Isabella laughed. The sound surprised her. It had been a long time since she'd laughed so genuinely. I'm just Isabella now, she said. Elena doesn't exist anymore. Rich studied her face. Is that really true? Last night when you were singing, that wasn't Isabella. That was Elena. That was one of the greatest sopranos of our time, doing what she was born to do. His words struck something deep inside her, a truth she had been avoiding for months. When she sang without restraint, she wasn't hiding or pretending. She was being her most authentic self. What happened? Rich asked gently. Why did you disappear? The rumors were all over the place. Vocal damage, mental breakdown, contract disputes. Isabella, or Elena, sighed and sat back down. It was simpler and more complicated than any of those things. I just couldn't do it anymore. The singing, the life, the constant pressure, the endless travel, the isolation despite being constantly surrounded by people. Every performance had to be perfect, more than perfect. Critics were waiting for the slightest flaw, the smallest sign of vocal fatigue or aging. I lived in fear of getting sick, of missing a high note, of disappointing the thousands of people who had paid to hear the great Elena Vassallo. She paused, the memories washing over her. And then one night in Berlin, I was about to go on stage for Lucia di Lammermoor, a role I'd sung dozens of times, and I couldn't move. Literally couldn't make myself walk onto that stage. They called it a panic attack, gave me something to calm me down. I finished the run of performances, then canceled everything else. Told my management I needed a break. That was 3 years ago. And you've been hiding in Maplewood ever since? Not the whole time. First there were doctors, therapists, vocal coaches making sure my voice wasn't damaged. Then a retreat in Switzerland. I spent 6 months in a cottage by a lake, not singing a note, barely speaking some days, just Healing. When I was ready to rejoin the world, but not that world, I changed my name, used some of my savings to buy this cottage, and here I am. Rich absorbed this in silence. Then he asked, "Do you miss it? The stage, the audiences?" Elena considered the question carefully. "I didn't for a long time. I was so burned out, so empty. But lately," she glanced toward the piano in the corner. "Lately, yes, I miss the music, the connection. That moment when you know you've touched someone with your voice. Like you did last night," Rich said softly. She nodded. "Like last night." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Rich straightened up. "So what do we do now? The concert is in 3 days. Arthur Peterson is already suspicious. If you sing the way you did at rehearsal, others might recognize you too." "I could back out," Elena suggested, though the thought sent a pang of disappointment through her. Rich shook his head. "The choir would be crushed. And honestly, after hearing you sing that aria properly, I'd be crushed too." He paused. "But I understand if you're not ready for people to know who you are." Elena walked to her piano and ran her fingers lightly over the keys. "I've been hiding for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be her anymore." Elena Vassallo, the opera star. "Maybe you don't have to be," Rich suggested. "Maybe you can just be who you are now, a woman with an extraordinary gift who's found a new way to share it." His words resonated with something Gabriella had said in that article. She needed time to rediscover why she fell in love with singing. In the first place, Elena turned to face Rich. "Can you keep my secret? At least until after the concert?" Rich nodded without hesitation. "Of course. Your secret is safe with me." "Thank you," she said, relieved. "I need to think about what comes." Next, after Rich left, Elena sat at her piano and began to play the introduction to Sempre Libera. As her fingers moved over the familiar notes, she felt a sense of coming home, not to the stages of Milan or New York, but to the music itself, the pure joy of creating something beautiful. The next day, as Elena was tending to her garden, a sleek black car pulled up outside her cottage. Her heart sank as she recognized the tall, elegant figure who emerged. Arthur Peterson, the former New York Times critic. He approached her gate with the confident stride of someone used to moving in much grander circles than Maplewood's quiet streets. "Good afternoon," he called. "Isabella Bennett, isn't it?" Elena straightened up, brushing soil from her hands. "Yes," she said cautiously. "Can I help you?" "I believe you can," he replied, his keen eyes studying her face. "I was at your rehearsal the other night. Your performance was illuminating." "Thank you," she said, making no move to invite him in. "I wonder if you might spare a few minutes." "To chat?" he continued. "I have a particular interest in operatic sopranos." "I'm quite busy today," Elena demurred. Peterson smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "I understand. Privacy is valuable. But I wanted you to know that I recognized you immediately, Ms. Vassallo." Elena felt her carefully constructed world tilting beneath her feet. "I think you're mistaken," she said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I don't think I am," he replied gently. "I heard you sing Violetta at your debut at the Met at La Scala and at your last performance at the Vienna State Opera before you took your leave of absence. I would recognize that voice anywhere." Elena stood frozen, caught between denial and resignation. "Your secret is safe with me," Peterson continued, surprising her. "I'm retired now. No more reviews, no more columns. I simply wanted to tell you what an honor it is to hear you sing again." "Why would you keep my secret?" Elena asked, suspicious. "Wouldn't revealing my whereabouts be quite a scoop for a critic?" Peterson's expression softened. "My dear, I've been in the music world for 40 years. I've seen what it does to artists. The pressure, the demands, the relentless scrutiny. Whatever reasons you had for stepping away, I respect them." He paused. "But I will say this. Music is the poorer without you." He reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "If you ever want to talk about music, Just music, not careers or comebacks, I would be honored. Otherwise, I'll simply look forward to your performance at the concert. As an appreciative audience member, nothing more. As Peterson walked back to his car, Elena stared at the card in her hand. For 3 years, she had been running from her past, hiding from who she truly was. Now, within the span of 2 days, 2 different people had discovered her secret, and neither had reacted with the invasive curiosity or demands for explanation that she had feared. Perhaps, she thought as she watched Peterson's car disappear, down the lane the world she had been hiding from existed more in her mind than in reality. Perhaps there was a way to be Elena Vassallo again, but on her own terms. The evening of the concert arrived with an electric sense of anticipation that seemed to hover over Maplewood like summer heat. The community hall, usually used for town meetings and bingo nights, had been transformed with twinkling lights and flowers donated by the local garden club. Rows of folding chairs stretched from wall to wall, with a makeshift stage set up at the front of the room. Elena stood backstage, peering through a gap in the curtains at the rapidly filling seats. Word had spread about the mystery soprano, with the extraordinary voice drawing people not just from Maplewood but from neighboring towns as well. She spotted Arthur Peterson in the 3rd row, looking distinguished in a blazer and tie. Beside him was an elegant older woman Elena didn't recognize. Quite a turnout, Rich commented, appearing at her side in a crisp white shirt and dark suit. I've never seen the hall this full. We might have to add more chairs. Elena stepped back from the curtain, smoothing the simple black dress she'd chosen for the performance. It was nothing like the elaborate costume she'd worn on the world's great stages, but it felt right for this moment, elegant but understated. Are you nervous? Rich asked. Elena considered the question. Throughout her career, she'd experienced every shade of performance anxiety, from mild butterflies to paralyzing terror. What she felt now was different, a quiet alertness, a readiness. No, she replied, surprised to find it was true. Not nervous, just present. Rich smiled. The choir's gathering in the side room for warm-ups. Shall we? As they walked to join the others, Elena was aware of curious glances from her fellow choir members. The article in the Maplewood Gazette had sparked speculation, and though no one had directly asked if she was the famous missing soprano, she sensed they were wondering. Judy approached her with an encouraging smile. Big night tonight, Isabella. Elena returned the smile, touched by the simple kindness of this woman who had welcomed her into the choir months ago without question. Yes, it is. Whatever happens out there, Judy added, squeezing her arm, we're all proud to sing with you. The simple sincerity of this statement brought unexpected tears to Elena's eyes. In her former life, surrounded by competitive colleagues and demanding directors, such straightforward support had been rare. Thank you, she said softly. That means more than you know. The warm-up exercises passed in a blur, and before Elena knew it, Rich was calling them to attention. Places, everyone, we're on in 5 minutes. The choir members filed out to take their positions on stage while Elena remained in the wings, waiting for her solo, which would come in the second half of the program. From her vantage point, she watched as the audience settled in, programs rustling, voices gradually lowering to a murmur of expectation. Rich stepped onto the stage to enthusiastic applause, bowed briefly, then turned to face the choir. With a lift of his hands, the concert began. Elena listened as the choir performed their opening numbers, a folk medley followed by a selection of Broadway favorites. They sang with heart, if not with perfect technique, and the audience responded warmly. She found herself smiling at particularly well-delivered passages, proud of how far the group had come since she'd joined them. During the brief intermission, Elena remained apart from the excited chatter of the choir members, using these final moments to center herself for her performance. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, feeling the familiar pre-performance ritual settle her into a state of focused calm. A tap on her shoulder broke her concentration. She turned to find Helen looking apologetic. Sorry to disturb you, Helen said, but there are some people asking for you at the back door. I told them you were preparing to perform, but they were quite insistent. Elena frowned. Who are they? They didn't say. A man and a woman, very well dressed. They said they were old friends. A chill ran through Elena. Had word somehow leaked out beyond Maplewood? Were reporters already gathering, eager for the story of Elena Vassallo's return? Tell them I'll speak. With them after the performance, she said firmly. Helen nodded and hurried away. Elena tried to recenter herself, but her calm had been disrupted. For the first time that evening, she felt a flutter of the old anxiety. 2 minutes, everyone, Rich called out. Places for the second half. The choir filed back onto the stage. Elena took a deep breath, pushing away thoughts of the mysterious visitors. Whatever happened after tonight's performance, she would face it then. Now, there was only the music. The second half of the program began with 2 classical pieces performed by the full choir. Then Rich stepped forward to address the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, for our final piece this evening, it is my great pleasure to introduce a very special soloist. She joined our humble choir several months ago, bringing with her a talent that, I can say without exaggeration, is world-class. A murmur rippled through the audience. Elena felt her heart quicken. Performing the aria, Sempre Libera, from Verdi's La Traviata, please welcome Isabella Bennett. As Elena stepped onto the stage, the applause was polite but restrained, the standard reception for an unknown performer in a small-town concert. She took her position center stage, nodded to Rich at the piano, and closed her eyes as the familiar introduction began. When she opened them again, she was no longer thinking about who she had been or what might come next. There was only this moment, this music, this chance to share the gift she had been given. She took a breath and began to sing. From the first note, Elena knew this performance was different from any she had given before. In her years on the world's great stages, she had often fought against fear. Fear of failure, fear of criticism, fear of not living up to impossible expectations. Now, that fear was gone. In its place was something purer. Joy. Her voice soared through the community hall, filling every corner with Violetta's passionate declaration of freedom. The coloratura passages that had once been technical challenges to be conquered now flowed from her with effortless grace. Each phrase told a story. Each note carried emotion that reached out to touch the audience. Elena was no longer performing for critics or opera aficionados. She was singing for the people of Maplewood, for Judy and Helen, for Rich, who had recognized her gift, for Arthur Peterson, who had respected her privacy, and for herself. As the aria built toward its climactic high notes, she felt tears of release and joy streaming down her face, yet her voice remained strong and clear. When the final note faded into silence, there was a heartbeat of complete stillness in the room. Then the audience erupted, not with polite applause, but with a roar of appreciation that seemed too large for the modest space. People leaped to their feet, some wiping away tears, others calling, "Brava," in the tradition of great opera houses. Rich stood from the piano, his face alight with pride and amazement. The choir members behind her were applauding too, some looking stunned by what they had just witnessed. Elena bowed deeply, overwhelmed by the response. As she straightened, her eyes caught a movement at the back of the hall. The mysterious visitors Helen had mentioned were standing just inside the entrance. With a jolt of recognition, Elena saw it was Gabriella Moretti, her former manager, and beside her, Antonio Barresi, the conductor who had first discovered her talent 20 years ago. They were both applauding, Gabriella openly weeping. The standing ovation continued as Elena took another bow, then gestured for Rich and the choir to join her. As the applause finally began to subside, Rich stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've all just been part of something extraordinary." His voice was thick with emotion. Some of you may have guessed, others might be wondering. The magnificent voice you just heard belongs not only to our own Isabella Bennett, but to one of the greatest sopranos of our time. A murmur of confusion spread through the audience. With her permission, Rich continued, looking to Elena for confirmation. "I have the honor of introducing, or perhaps reintroducing, Elena Vassallo. The murmur became a buzz of astonishment. Elena stepped forward, taking a deep breath. After 3 years of hiding, of being someone else, she was about to reclaim her name, but on her own terms. "Thank you, Rich," she said, her speaking voice carrying easily through the hall. "Yes, I am Elena Vassallo. 3 years ago I stepped away from the opera world because I had lost my way, not vocally, but spiritually. The music that had once been my greatest joy had become a burden." She paused, looking out at the rapt faces of the audience. Coming to Maplewood, joining this wonderful choir as just another singer, it gave me back something precious. It reminded me why I began singing in the first place, for the pure love of music and for the connection it creates between people. Tonight, singing for you, I felt that joy again, and for that gift, I am profoundly grateful. The audience responded with another round of heartfelt applause. As Elena looked toward the back of the room, she saw Gabriella and Antonio making their way forward. She stepped down from the stage to meet them. "How did you find me?" she asked as Gabriella embraced her. "Arthur Peterson," Gabriella explained. "An old friend. He called me after he recognized you, said I might want to be here tonight." She stepped back, studying Elena's face. "He was right. We've missed you, Elena," Antonio said simply. "I've missed music," Elena replied. "But I can't go back to the way things were." "No one's asking you to," Gabriella assured her. "But perhaps there's a middle path, a way to share your gift without the crushing schedule and pressure that drove you away." As they talked, audience members had begun to gather around, some asking for autographs, others simply wanting to express their appreciation. Elena was touched by their warmth and lack of intrusion. Later that night, as the hall emptied and the choir members helped to stack chairs, Rich approached Elena. "So," he said, "what happens now? Does Isabella Bennett disappear and Elena Vassallo return to the world stage?" Elena smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. "Neither, I think. I'm not running anymore from who I was or who I am, but I'm also not going back to a life that nearly broke me." "What then?" Rich asked. Elena looked around the simple community hall that had just witnessed her return to authentic performance. "I think I might stay in Maplewood, at least for now. Perhaps teach a bit. There must be young singers at the community college who could use some guidance, and maybe sometimes sing again. Small venues, meaningful music on my own terms." Rich smiled. "Our choir would still welcome you, you know, though I suspect our regular Christmas concert might draw a slightly larger crowd this year." Elena laughed, a free and joyful sound. "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." As they walked out into the summer night, stars bright above the sleepy town, Elena felt as if she had finally found the right key, the perfect balance between the extraordinary gift she had been given and the ordinary life she had come to cherish. Not Elena Vassallo, opera star. Not Isabella Bennett, anonymous choir member. Just herself, at last, in harmony with her own true voice.